Welcome everyone to the meeting this morning. It's a very important subject, as obvious from all the people that are interested in what's going on today. We're going to have a little bit of a briefing. As we're going through the briefing, Rusty is going to be running that portion of it. If anyone has questions during that portion, please feel free to interrupt and ask your questions at that time so that we make sure that all questions are answered. Also, to make sure that we know who all's in the room, I think we probably ought to quickly go around the room and introduce ourselves. We'll start on the back row and go around the outside and then come around the inside, if that's okay. So you get to start first.
Okay. Danielle Young, City Administrator in Cheney.
I'm Brad Daly, Fire Chief in Cheney. Brandon Mills, Budget Analyst, Sedgwick County.
Bethany Crowell, HR Director, Sedgwick County.
Maureen Showalter, Area Budget, Sedgwick County.
Donald Martin, Assistant City Manager, Wichita.
Brian Chris, Deputy Fire Chief, Wichita Fire Department.
Tammy Snow, Fire Chief, Wichita Fire Department.
I'm Rick Brazil, I'm retired Deputy Chief, Sedgwick County Fire.
Lindsay Coverso, CFO, Sedgwick County.
Tanya Cole, Director of Facilities, Sedgwick County.
Carol Cole, Executive Secretary, County Commissioner's Office.
Tim Coleman, Assistant County Manager of Public Services, Sedgwick County.
Emily Levy, Communications, Sedgwick County. Kay Clavin, Public Information Officer, Sedgwick County.
Heather Zaragoza, County Manager's Intern, Sedgwick County.
Keith Faircone, County Manager's Intern.
Super. Rusty, why don't you come around the other direction?
I'm Rusty Lee, Assistant County Manager.
Thomas Lee, Fire Chief, Sedgwick County.
Kevin Nelson, Captain, Sedgwick County. Larry Tangy, Deputy Chief, Sedgwick County.
Justin Wagoner, Assistant County Counselor. Kevin Stamper, Assistant County Counselor.
Karen Powell, Deputy County Counselor.
Eric Gill, County Council. Will Deere, Assistant County Council.
Jim Helm, Sedgwick County Commissioner.
Richard Ramsell, Sedgwick County Commissioner.
Dave Unruh, Sedgwick County Commissioner.
David Dennis, Sedgwick County Commissioner.
Mike O'Donnell, Sedgwick County Commissioner.
Mike Schultz, County Manager.
Tom Schultz, Deputy County Manager.
Kathy Sexton, Derby City Manager.
Ryan Smith, Derby Fire Chief. Mo Allman, Bentley, and Sedgwick County Fire Reserve Chief.
Mike Rowell, College Fire Chief.
Lawrence Fan, Assistant Fire Chief, Mountain Hope.
Lowell Lester, Captain with Mulvane Fire Department.
Gordon Bell, Director of Public Safety, Mulvane.
Ron Mars, City Administrator, Clearwater. Lloyd Inwood, Public Safety Director, Dallas.
And David Spears, Public Works. Gary, come on in. Gary Plummer from Chamber of Commerce. You're welcome. Well, I feel very safe today for two reasons. One, we have all of the first responders here, and also we have, I think, every attorney in Sedgwick County with us today. So if anyone's going to get sued, they're going to take care of us. Anyway, Rusty, take it off.
Good morning, Commissioners and distinguished guests. So, to give some context to what we're going to talk about today, back in 12, 13, 14, the fire district was experiencing some financial difficulties with the economy down. The district implemented some strategies to try to mitigate that, and as the economy came back, we've returned to a position where currently we're fairly healthy budget-wise. However, we understand that the economy can change again. We understand that the fire district is limited in the area that it covers. It's dependent upon property taxes for support, and if that area begins to shrink or the property valuation declines again, then we could find ourselves back in a position where we have financial difficulties. So to that end, in an attempt to try to understand, number one, who we are and where we are right now, and try to determine how we can move forward in the future to ensure financial stability, we kind of did a SWOT analysis of sorts. That's kind of what this paper represents. We went in and pulled statistics from our Firehouse software in order to try to understand what kind of calls we're making, who we're assisting, who's assisting us, what that call volume looks like, look at our financials, look at what we do well, what we don't do well, what we need assistance with. And at the end of the day, the paper that we produced that all of you have had, most of you have either had or had an opportunity to look at, is what we're going to cover today, kind of page by page, in order to generate some conversation and discussion. At the end of the day, the numbers are not something that are universal. I understand that any department in this room can run their own numbers. Their numbers are going to be slightly different. It's something certainly to be talked about. It's something that we ought to look for as we move forward to kind of standardize to the extent that everybody wants to those types of statistics so that we know where we are. I think if you crunch the numbers closely, there's going to be some variation, but I don't think they're going to be dramatic at the end of the day. So while that's something we can talk about, I don't really want to get too far in the weeds debating the details of numbers unless somebody just really feels inclined to do so. The real intent of this is to walk through the paper, hear some voices, opinions, ideas, thoughts on ways to go forward to ensure that, number one, the county has quality medical first response and fire coverage across the board, and how we ensure that not only Sedgwick County Fire District, but others in the county remain financially solvent going into the future, or is there some model we need to move toward in order to ensure that in the future? So that's kind of what today's about. With that said, I'll start, and as the commissioner indicated, the chairman indicated that if somebody needs clarification or has something that they wish to offer, please raise your hand, speak up. I am not the subject matter expert, so I may defer to fire staff who are, or to folks in the audience who have that knowledge. All right. So today is about providing an evaluation of this paper for the governing body and the others in the room. We'll follow the paper as the agenda and move through the areas of the paper, as you can see on the board, and if you have a copy in front of you. So we'll try to stay on track and not jump around too much if we don't have to. So the executive summary of the paper is really intended to kind of give us an overview of what we're going to be talking about. One thing that we need to understand is that this is not something new. We've had very long-standing relationships with all of our partners. The city of Wichita goes back as far as 1959 from documentation that I can find. We had a mutual aid agreement that was signed with the city of Wichita in 1959, and there have been iterations of that over the years up until the present. We signed a new revised agreement with the city of Wichita, an aid agreement of sorts, on August 30th, just a few days ago. We also have agreements with other entities across the county and some just outside the borders of the county. Some of those agreements date as far back as 20 plus years and probably need to be updated at this point. Another thing this paper looks at is long-term financial stability of the department. So we do some financial analysis, and ultimately we get to the end where we're looking at what our potential threats are going into the future. Those threats have been identified in the past and generally continue to stay the same. Annexation has been identified as a potential threat. Looking at a study from back in the early 2000s, it was identified that annexation was a continuing threat, and that paper indicated a belief that annexation would have advanced further today than it actually has. So while annexation has occurred and the district has lost some property that provided income in the past, the degree to which that annexation occurred has not lived up to what that paper projected at the time. Valuation declines are always economy-based, and then tax exemptions, the issuance of industrial revenue bonds and those types of instruments that allow for taxes to be deferred also have an ability to hamper the financial stability of the district. So those things will be talked about as we move through. Looking at the finances, reviewing the finances of the district, debt service is something that we have to look at. In the past, it was determined that we needed to relocate stations, and we had a number of station relocations or new builds. Some of those stations were paid for with capital improvement monies, and some of those stations were paid through a bond issuance, a 20-year bond at $7.9 million. Balance remains on that and will pay out in 2034, and currently we're paying just under $400,000 a year annually on that debt service. So that's an annual cost to the district projected through 2034. The assessed valuation growth in Sedgwick County has been greater than Sedgwick County as a whole. The market value of properties and utilities has been greater in Sedgwick County over the past 5 or 6 years than Sedgwick County as a whole. And as you can see from the chart, assessed values have continued to climb since 2013 up to present, and are approaching 5% growth in that realm. And then finally, fund balance, as valuations have improved over the past 5 or 6 years, fund balance has also become healthier. Starting in 2014, we saw a small increase over 13 until today, where we have a fund balance of about $7.34 million. And if it stays on track, we're projecting that that could rise another $1.5 million to $2 million by the end of 19. Something that we are doing with that represents about 151% increase in value to our fund balance between 2014 and 2018. With that fund balance, it has provided us the opportunity to go back and restore some services and some staffing that were held back when the economy was not as good and our balance was not as good. So at the end of this year and going into 2019, we've been able to take 6 firefighter positions that were held, unfunded and unstaffed, and reinstate those positions. Fire Station 31 in Andale is slated for an upgrade, potentially a new build, which we're projecting will come in at approximately $1.85 million. Those two things will help draw down some of that fund balance so that we don't have excess monies, excess revenues sitting, but it reestablishes services that we had forgone in the past and improves services out in the northwest part of the county. Vehicle and apparatus plan was developed and has been refined. That plan helped save money over the past couple of years by deferring purchases, but it also has allowed us to better forecast and plan for apparatus replacement going forward in the future, so that we can plan for that in our fund balance and with our incoming revenues, so we know what the costs are going to be in the future and we know how it's going to impact us. Keeps our equipment up to date and modern and functional. We also had in the past determined that we would flatten the organization a bit. We would reclass 6 captain positions to lieutenant positions to provide some savings. At this point, we are about 4/6 through that. We've had 4 captains retire, and those positions have been reclassed to lieutenants. We have 2 positions left to go. So those are things that have been done to improve the health of the district, and then also to restore some services that had been foregone in the past since fund balance has improved. Moving to the background, understanding what environment we live and operate in. We identify 12 municipal fire departments across the county. 3 of those we identify as professional full-time. We understand that Valley Center has made expenditures within the past year to increase their full-time staffing to 4 bodies. I believe they cover 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and then they have volunteers who are on call and I believe paid to respond to fires. The other jurisdictions have 1 or 2 perhaps paid staff, and the rest are staffed with volunteer personnel. And then we have 2 jurisdictions in the county that fall within the fire district, Viola and Bentley. Both of those have volunteer fire departments. Bentley actually is staffed largely by Sedgwick County Fire Reserves, but is housed in Bentley and has some support from the city of Bentley. Viola has some support from the city of Viola. However, all of them pay into the fire district and act as supplemental support for the fire district. So that's kind of the environment that we're working in Sedgwick County, and who provides fire service, response to potentially vehicle accidents, injury vehicle accidents, and I think the majority of them provide some medical first response. Not all, but the majority of them have credentialed EMTs and provide medical first response. And just as a visual for what that looks like, you have Clearwater, which covers the city proper and Nenasko Township. You have Cheney, which covers Cheney proper and 3 townships, as well as 1 or 2 jurisdictions across the county line in Kingman County. Mount Hope up in the northwest, which covers Mount Hope and Greeley County, or Greeley Township, I'm sorry. And Then Derby, of course, Valley Center, covers Valley Center proper. It's my understanding that they received some small stipends from Valley Center, Park, and Grant Townships to provide some supplemental service in those areas as well, although they're only, their primary jurisdiction is the city limits. And then Colwich covers Colwich and the township there as well. City of Wichita obviously is the big player and covers their city limits. So, doing a bit of a peer review to see if there's some model out there that is exceptional or that we should fall into and follow. The initial research indicates that there's really no standard model. There is no industry standard for what fire service should look like. It is largely determined by the jurisdictions that have responsibility for that type of public safety service. They range across the board. Jurisdictions that we looked at largely have volunteer fire departments that cover most of rural areas. To have paid departments in those areas is not necessarily a common thing. Jackson County, Missouri was different in that the fire board was independent of the county. It was not a county fire board. And then looking at St. Louis County had no county fire. Their commission acted as a fire standards commission to help normalize the type of training and service across the multiple jurisdictions. I think they had 23 paid departments and 20 volunteer or something like that, so it's a very large jurisdiction. But there is no standard model out there. Most counties rely on volunteer departments to cover the rural areas, and the municipal areas, particularly the large municipal areas, are covered with paid departments. Johnson County is probably the closest. They actually have 10 paid departments that cover the entire county, but they do have a fire district that answers to the county board. So they're the one that's probably the closest to us, with the exception of all of their departments appear to be paid in Johnson County, where we have 3 paid and the rest are primarily volunteer. So we don't have a lot to work with there as far as looking at a standard model. There is not one. Area resources and aid agreements. So the state mutual aid system compact is a statutory allowance for jurisdictions to aid each other in the time when a disaster is declared. There are lots of rules that apply to that. Generally speaking, in order to receive any kind of compensation from such a response, it generally is agreed at the front end that that's going to happen. It definitely requires that the municipality or the district that's responding to that disaster submit specific paperwork within a specific time frame in order to request payment, but they're not obligated to do so. They can waive compensation, and in most instances they don't seek compensation unless there is a federal declaration and there are federal monies that are pushed into that disaster to help cover those costs. With that said, the Kansas Mutual Aid Compact also has language that allows for local jurisdictions to enter into intrastate agreements amongst themselves to provide support to each other in the smaller jurisdictional setting, such as in Sedgwick County. To that end, Sedgwick County Fire District does have 12 such agreements with departments within the county. Those agreements are both auto aid and or mutual aid, or a combination of both, depending on the jurisdiction. And auto aid agreements, when we enter into those are agreements where we auto dispatch. 911 emergency communications is notified that this auto aid agreement exists, and in these particular circumstances, resources should be automatically dispatched without being asked for. That generally applies to structure fires. Those agreements are generally set up so that if there is a structure fire in, say, Valley Center, Fire District 1 will be automatically dispatched to assist with that fire, and vice versa. If there's a fire just outside of Valley Center in the county, in close proximity, when county fire is dispatched, Valley Center will be automatically dispatched as well if they have that automatic aid agreement, so that we have all of those resources responding simultaneously without delay. Mutual aid agreements are more of a ask for type agreement. if we need you and we ask for your assistance, you agree to come if you have the resources to send them. So there is some obligation. We're saying if we have the resources, we will definitely send them. But if for some reason our district is overwhelmed and they're asking for assistance, we don't have the ability to send them, then we're not obligated by that to send what we don't have. So those are the differences between the two types of agreements.
Hey, question.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain jumping calls and when do you usually see that?
I'll defer to the chief.
Good morning, commissioners and partners this morning. Jumping calls, manager, is where you're not dispatched on the alarm and say you're just going to go. You're from another entity or even from within our own, which we don't allow. You could just say, I'm going to self-dispatch to that alarm. So that's what jumping the calls are.
But usually the unit is closer, though. The unit that jumps the call. It should be closer if they're going to jump the call. But firefighters are firefighters. They all want to go.
How many, is that a common occurrence? When do you usually see that?
Big fires, building fires, structure fires, you'll see that, or an unusual type of event, you'll see that.
And currently, there's no way you can quantitate how that happens. That's part of the statistical challenge. When we look at how we're responding countywide, agencies going into other agencies, there's no way to calculate jumping calls. There's no way for us to look at that.
I'll speak to that in the sense that the data that we used for our report for internal evaluation purposes was the firehouse data. That's the data that we used to report to the state of Kansas. So that is manual entry based on reporting by the firefighters and the supervisors who respond to an incident. When they respond, and it's just like, if there are rules on documentation, you would expect that they would follow the rules that if we request aid from another jurisdiction, when you get back and do your report, you check the box that says mutual aid received or auto aid received. Over time, if that training deteriorates, it's a subjective type of documentation. So firefighters, those filling out the reports, become subjective at determining whether it was mutual aid or auto aid, whether we actually requested it or whether they self-dispatched. And quickly it becomes difficult to decipher when a jurisdiction self-dispatched. We may have requested aid and said we need an engine, and they may have sent 2 engines and a tender. We're probably not going to capture that in the statistics because we're going to just indicate that we asked for aid, and the aid generally requires 1 engine. If they sent more resources than we asked for, that's going to get lost in the documentation. If they self-dispatched because they were in close proximity and it was a big raging fire and they thought we could use the help, so they came to see if they could help. If somebody checks the box mutual aid or auto aid received, then that's how it's going to go down in history, and we're not going to realize that we didn't actually ask for them, they came on their own. Vice versa, if we ask for them and they don't come, I'm not sure that we would capture that in documentation through the checkbox method. It would be captured in a narrative that may not get counted somewhere down the road. So it's that type of statistical stuff that's difficult to capture. Even through, whether it's through Firehouse or through CAD, require a great deal of manual manipulation to be able to pull that type of information out. It's not just something that would show up on a chart or on a standard run report, at least with the CAD system we have now or with the Firehouse product that we have now. You agree, Kat? Does that help? Okay. All right. So, going back. Currently we have the 12 agreements. This is a representation of the 12 agreements that we have and with whom we have them. Some are auto aid, structured fires only. A few of them are mutual aid. And on the right-hand column, it shows what type of apparatus or what type of equipment is required. with that aid agreement. And as you can see, some of them date back, to the best of our knowledge, the last signed copy. And being evergreen, they roll over unless somebody says they want to discontinue. We know that some of the language in some of these is outdated and probably needs to be revised based on current standards and current capabilities. And that's something we need to do going forward. As I indicated, we renewed with the City of Wichita on August 30th of this year. I think it's probably in our best interest to start moving through these jurisdictions and reviewing those agreements that we have currently with them and determining if they fit the needs of both based on our current capabilities and what needs to change in those. To be sure, Sedgwick County Fire District 1 receives benefit from auto and mutual aid agreements. Looking at the map earlier where we saw all the different jurisdictions where their fire stations were located, there are areas of the county where, in spite of our station locations, there are some areas that we can't get to as fast as some of our partners. You look down in the southeast part of the county, coming from our South Oliver station or our Station 38 out in Minnehaha Township, or even from Hayesville, there's areas in the southeast part of the county that Derby and Mulvane can get to more quickly than we can if we have those aid agreements in place and if they are willing to respond or able to respond. Same way out in the southwest part of the county, it's potential that Clearwater or Cheney may have better coverage in some of those areas than we have as far as timely response. So there's areas that we benefit from mutual aid and auto aid agreements that we currently have in place based on the placement of our stations and the resources that we have. In the same token, other jurisdictions benefit from their agreements with us, as well as the agreements that they have among themselves. A lot of these jurisdictions enter into the same types of aid agreements with each other, so they may not depend on Sedgwick County Fire District. In a lot of instances, they will call on each other to assist each other with certain types of incidents that we may not get involved with. The majority of our aid given and received is, if you look at the map, in close proximity to population centers. And that's true whether it's fire service or EMS service or law enforcement service. But looking at the fire map, you can see that the areas that are most dense in calls are generally population centers, including Garden Plain is a brighter color where there's a population. Up in Andale, you get down even to Viola, it's a little brighter than the rest of the county. Then obviously you get in closer to the metropolitan area, up around Bel Air, down in Hayesville, out in Goddard. Goddard has a dense population and we do a lot of coverage out there. So it's generally the population centers where coverage is going to occur because that's where the structures are, that's where the people are, that's where the medical services are needed. And that's just the reality that those are where the services are going to be. Sprinkled across that map, it's hard to see, but you can see there's other responses in the county, but they're one here, one there. They're hit and miss. And you get out to some of the jurisdictions like Cheney and up in Mount Hope, you don't see much of our coloration there because while we may assist them occasionally, it's very rare. They're covering themselves in most instances. This is data from our firehouse. Again, I understand that other people's data collection system, we're not going to have numbers that match exactly, depending on how we document. But this is just a depiction of where our numbers came from and how we arrived at them. The areas that are yellow or orange indicate in a 5-year average, we run about 9,200 calls a year on average. In comparison, Wichita runs about 55,000, and then as you go down, the other jurisdictions' numbers are going to be significantly less than than Sedgwick County Fire District is. About 25%, a little over 25% of the 9,200 calls we make are documented by our report writers as aid given to another jurisdiction, and then about 1,200 of those 9,200 are documented as receiving aid from another jurisdiction.
Mr.
Yes.
Back up a couple of slides, back to the mutual aid agreements. I wanted to interject something here. Mutual aid agreements are not only for the benefit of responding to help one another out. Back in 2005, we did a fire station relocation plan. And the orders that were given to me, the chief promoter at the time, from was to give with the city of Wichita and put these fire stations where we're not going to have a fire station down the street from one another. And ISO was the driving force. Since the mill levy in the fire district was high, we felt that we needed to be able to give a benefit back to the citizens of the fire district by lowering the insurance rates. There were about 3,000 homes affected that had lower insurance rates. And these insurance rates were not only lowered in the fire district, but areas outside of the fire district. That 2020 hindsight looking back, there's probably a lot more folks out of the fire district that benefit from lower insurance rates than in the fire district. But again, we were in a consolidation talk with the city of Wichita. We combined our maintenance facilities, we were training together, we were looking at fire station placement, and I think it was working too well because they pulled the plug on all of it. But anyway, ISO was the driving force. I mean, we've always had mutual aid agreements. You're correct that we go back to the 50s on those mutual aid agreements, but the ones that are currently in effect were for the insurance rates. That was really the driving force.
I did read some of the materials from the past that indicated that ISO was a driving force. It was an attempt by, I believe if I read it correctly, the commissioners at the time had an interest in helping lower ISO ratings across the county to help with insurance rates for all citizens across the county, and some of that was what was driving some of the decisions at that point in time.
So when you ask the question, why are we responding, or why is Sedgwick County Fire responding so much into these other areas? That was the decision making at the time, was to have these aid agreements in place so everyone within Sedgwick County would benefit in lower insurance rates. It affected businesses more than it did homeowners. I slept too many nights. I don't have those figures at the top of my head, but we ran figures on how much the dollars for residents versus business in lower insurance rates. It was quite significant. So again, that's the reason why a lot of these aid agreements are in place, and that's why our fire stations are where they are today. You mentioned the southeast part of the county. And at the time, there was some arguments on, are we abandoning those folks in the southeast part of the county? And Derby and Mulvane stepped up, and they answered probably 99% of the alarms in that area of the county when I was there, because they're so much closer. But on the flip side, we would respond to Mulvane or Derby on a structure fire or any other type of call that we were needing. I'll go back to the jumping calls that the manager. Back when I was there, CAD, computer-aided dispatch, was brand new. Folks didn't have a lot of confidence in it. The computer-aided dispatch would, and vehicle locator would tell what units are closest to the alarm. On what the computer, on what CAD would recommend its closest units. Technology, has its flaws, and it's new, and I can speak for, I think, the city guys, city fire and county fire, that we didn't have a lot of confidence in it. And we hear a call come in your station's jurisdiction, and another unit was dispatched. And so that prompted some of that jumping in calls. People felt like they were closer than, the units that were being dispatched to that call.
It sounds like that's still going on. I don't know if it's because there's not confidence in the computer-aided dispatch and the vehicle locator system, or if that's just ingrained in our fire service culture here. But that's an administrative decision. That could be taken care of by the chief saying, you don't go unless you're dispatched. The problem with that is sometimes our folks are right. They are closer, and we sure wouldn't want to go to a call, especially some type of a medical emergency, when we are the closest unit and they send someone farther away. So that's kind of a rock and a hard place. But again, back to the mutual aid. The driving force when I was there was to lower the insurance rates and make sure that these stations were in good locations for the next 50 years to service, but not have fire stations close together, different jurisdictions. So we're in that's why we're here today, because we have an issue here, and the frustration that I had when I was in administration there was we never could plan, and you touched on this earlier, as communities that aren't in a fire district can annex at will, it deteriorates the fire district's budget. So for us to be able to plan in the future for fire stations, for apparatus, for personnel, and we don't know what our tax base is going to be in the next 2 to 3 years, because we don't know if we're going to have that area to cover and collect the taxes off of. That's been a detriment to the fire district ever since the fire district was formed. When people can leave at will by signing a petition, whether it's a property owner or a city or a township, that really puts the fire district at a disadvantage. And I'm not going to point any fingers or say anybody is taking advantage of the fire district, but my personal opinion is that has happened. I sat through consolidation talks with the city of Wichita. I studied fire department consolidations when I was back at the fire academy. Sedgwick County spent a lot of money on me to have me go back and learn about fire districts and municipalities, and I learned a lot back there. There are a lot of communities in this country that are in the same position we're in right now. The difference is they've done something about it, and we have not done anything about it here. We've talked about it a lot. In my career, I'm not going to date myself here, but when I walked in the door of the fire station, they said, in 5 years, you'll be part of the city of Wichita. Well, that never happened. We talked about it, and I'm not saying that's the way to go here, is consolidate Wichita and Sedgwick County, but it might be. Or it might be to consolidate the fire departments around Sedgwick County and create a new entity, a new fire district. But again, that takes work and it takes effort, and I don't think the political will has ever been there. It takes some effort at the state level to change some state laws, and with all the other things the commissioners have to worry about, comp care and education and jail and all the other issues that affect the commissioners, the fire district has been kind of low on the totem pole, on the back burner. Nobody has really taken the interest or the time to want to make our fire district's future solid, whether it's standalone or whether it's combined with another department or combined with several other departments. But it can be done. It's been done all over the United States. 5, 6 fire departments, municipalities with fire districts, sewer districts, water districts. They're always kind of looked down at. I sat in a lot of Mr. Buchanan's classes over the years, believe me, at Wichita State. And no offense to the managers in this room, but I think they teach those folks that we provide everything. We provide the sewer, we provide the roads, we provide the police, the parks, the recreation. And that's great. They look a little bit down on districts, whether it's sewer, water, or fire, as one-issue government, which actually they're very efficient because they only have that one area to deal with. And they can set their tax levy where they want it. That's the beauty about a fire district. When you have commissioners that are independent and you have people that within the district that can have a say, if you want a Cadillac Fire Department, you want a fire station on every corner, you're going to pay for it. But if you can get away from that and maybe not have a fire station on every corner, you can pay for that too. So that's where I think we're at here, in my opinion. I see us, these cycles, this is at least the fourth one I've seen since I've been affiliated with Sedgwick County.
That's kind of what we're trying to get to, though.
And we go through these same motions, but it really is going to take some political will. There's always going to be egos. There's always going to be politics. There's always going to be a reason we can't do it. But we're ahead of the game here. We have growth, which is a good thing for all of us. We have a consolidated 911 system. A lot of fire departments that talk about automatic aid, mutual aid, auto aid agreements, they don't have a central dispatch system. We do. So we're ahead of the game. So we really need, if we want a solution to this problem, we need some leaders.
We'll get into some of that stuff here in just a minute if we want to move forward.
Again, I got on my soapbox, and I didn't mean to do that, but I just wanted to be sure I got some of those things
We'll
out
push on
there
to some options here in a minute.
in the open. So
generate some more conversation.
I'll yield to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, I understand that the ISO rating was something that was a driving force, and it had to do with, also to do with water hauling in the areas that didn't have sufficient water. It allowed the district to have resources that could help bring more water, which help with ISO ratings in rural areas. And that's changed a little bit, not dramatically, but there has been some change over time. When we talk about the aid given and received, generally it falls into structure fires, medical calls, or others being grass fires, vehicle collisions, and that type of response. And the greatest type of aid given and received by the fire district is generally in the other category. It's not fires. We do provide a lot of assistance with medical calls because medical calls represent about half or a little more than half of our calls. And in the city of Wichita, I think it's as high as about 80% medical. But other tends to be the category that we provide the most aid in as a fire district. And generally speaking, we provide aid based on the type of call. We may have some minimum standard for what we send, but based on the type of call and request, we will respond accordingly if we have the resources. This is an illustration just again to, on some level, point out where the aid is distributed most often in population centers. Colwich, Sedgwick. Sedgwick is pretty self-sufficient, and or they work with Harvey County resources a lot more than they work with Sedgwick County resources. Mulvane is also split on the county line. We have a lot of interaction with them, but they have resources and responsibilities on the other side of the county line as well. The Derby, Wichita, Valley Center, Mulvane, areas that are populated are where we end up providing aid. And those departments are also generally the departments from which we receive the most aid, whether it be structure fires or medical. When we're talking about responses with our peers across the county, we look at how that impacts our ability to utilize resources. There are some national standards that are set that we try to follow, and generally speaking, when we're dealing with full-time professional fire departments, if we're responding and the effective response force recommendation is 17 personnel on scene. With a full-time, if we send part of that and they send part of that, we're able to count all resources present. It doesn't require us to fully staff that ourselves because we can rely on our peers to provide some of that staffing support. When we're dealing with most volunteer fire departments, if we're required to have 17 on scene, we generally cannot count their resources toward that effective response force. Therefore, we have to pull more of our resources into that incident and or rely on other full-time paid departments to provide that additional staffing. So while the volunteers are very valuable, they provide resources, apparatus, and staff to run those. As far as being able to indicate that we have sufficient staff on site to ensure safety, we can't count those resources. We can utilize those resources, but not count them. Yes, sir.
Well, what do you mean we can't count them? I don't understand. If they're there and they're doing it, I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Chief, you want to get into the details?
Are we saying that's because what the NFPA says we can't count it? Well, that's, to me, that doesn't make sense. I want to deal with what's on the ground, and if we have resources there and we use them, but we can't tie ourselves to something that's a national level funding. That doesn't make sense unless I'm missing something there. If they're there, they're there. We're going to use them if they're qualified. If they're qualified, we ought to count them.
The resources will be utilized, but we don't count them toward the NFPA standard of safety standard.
Right. So what we're meeting is the deployment model. So the deployment model says you're going to have so many people on the scene. So when we have a structure fire, we're counting on the deployment of Sedgwick County. What are we going to deploy on this structure fire? And those are the units that we count.
Well, you understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
Let's not get tied down on something that's written on paper and let it control the way we operate. I mean, that doesn't make sense, okay? If we have resources that are part-time or volunteer, they're qualified, and we can pull them in, because basically what we're saying, we can pull them in, but we still got, so we're using, we're using more resources than what we really can say or need, and so that means we're tying up people from all different areas unnecessarily, just because of some standard that's written in a book.
Right. If they're available and if they're staffed, is something else you have to look at. Well, we know we're going to have those people staffed in our station, so that is a part of our deployment model.
I get all that.
Okay.
You understand my point? That's something we need to look at. I mean, this isn't a, I thought I was told this was a guideline, and we can be flexible, we can adapt it to our own, but this is something we need to look at, because that just doesn't make sense.
And Commissioner, I think you're correct. If they're qualified, if they're trained to a level that they can provide that type of support, then there's really no reason not to count them.
See, I come from the Army Department. We have active duty, guard, reserve, right?
Yep.
You're trained up, you're qualified, and we don't say, well, we've got to have all these active duty, we're going to bring in reserve, but we're not going to count the reserve. That doesn't make sense. I mean, that's why we have them as part of the overall force, right?
Correct. And on some level, that gets into a discussion about training standards and training levels, type of training and types of experience that different agencies have. There is no state mandated minimum standard.
Well, there doesn't need to be standard. We know how to fight fires. We can do our own training here. I mean, we train our guys, and we can make sure the guys and all the other areas, we can work together. We don't need to look to the NFPA or the state to hold our hand every time. We just need to do it and say, this is how we're going to do it.
And looking at that same standard, volunteer department's standard is based on population density, slightly lower, but not significantly lower than what a full-time department would be required to have if you follow that standard. That's kind of what those tables depict there. And what degree of staffing it draws from. Sedgwick County, to staff according to the standard, require 40% of our on-duty staff. Whereas Derby, approximately 77 based on that table, and Wichita with the on-duty staff about 12%. Just to look at some commonalities that we have with Wichita and with other jurisdictions, some things that we do jointly, training-wise and operations-wise, includes hazardous materials, technical rescue, some service-related services, and then other jurisdictions in the county, including Sedgwick County, are involved with Task Force 5, State Fire Marshal's Task Force 5 Search and Rescue, and the EMTs across the county and paramedics are generally all credentialed in the same manner through the Office of Medical Direction. So they have those types of trainings in common and those types of services that we have in common already. There is opportunities for other unifications perhaps, and we'll get to that in a little while. Then we looked at what the cost would be, what the cost of service is, pulling equipment and personnel out of a station to make a call. There are FEMA schedules for equipment rates that apply in disaster response type situations. They provide a table that gives guidance on what rates should be, and the eligible cost recovery includes costs of owning, operating, and maintaining those types of equipment. We recognize that there are jurisdictional variables that exist when it comes to the actual cost of operating equipment and personnel costs, and so trying to arrive at some number of what we expend rolling out of the station to a scene and then back to the station. Captain Nelson did some work in conjunction with Fleet and looking at personnel costs and fleet costs, came up with tentative numbers of what it would cost to if we moved towards some type of fee schedule particularly, but in overall just generally understanding what the cost is for us to pull out of the station and make a call. These are the rates that we came up with. For a brush truck to roll out, $74 an hour, all the way up to a deployment of 4 apparatus, a brush truck, an engine, a squad, and a tender at the bottom. $364 an hour are the rates that we came up with to make a call per hour. City of Wichita did similar type calculations and shared those with us. Their numbers are a little bit different, but not dramatically. The types of equipment that they listed are similar to what we did. Their salary costs are a little higher than ours, so there is some slight variation in per apparatus or per equipment cost per hour, but it's not dramatic, and I think a lot of that probably has to do as much with the cost of labor on the city side compared to ours as anything else.
Rusty, a question on those.
Yes, sir.
Are those just the cost of the firefighters, or do they include depreciation and cost of the apparatus?
That's the cost of maintaining and operating the apparatus, excluding mileage, plus the cost of personnel. That's the way that was calculated. Is that correct, Captain? So.
Okay, thank you.
Looking at financial comparisons, we attempted to look at financial comparisons to determine, again, how we stack up to the other jurisdictions in the county. Again, this is kind of one of those look-ats as whether it's a threat to the fire district in the long term, looking at the value of fire service across the other jurisdictions. So we know what our mill levy is, at least for 18, it's 18.392 mills. And looking at a $100,000 home, the cost of that property owner is approximately $211 per year for fire service in the county. Attempting to calculate what other jurisdictions are spending on fire service was a little more tricky, but we did the best that we could and applied a similar mill levy type charge to it, and found that based on the numbers that we were able to crunch, the cost of fire service to a owner of a $100,000 home in those jurisdictions ranges anywhere from just under $19 to about $186 per year for those property owners. Getting into that, based on, again, reviewing the budgets of those jurisdictions, where they have line itemed out what they're spending on fire service, understanding that they may not have costs for capital investments or debt service in those numbers. We did the best that we could to try to figure out exactly what they're spending per year on fire service. Tried to calculate that into a mill levy equivalent, and then applied that to the cost of a $100,000 home. We know that that math is not exact, but we were trying to get some feel for where they were at without, see where we compared up. So generally speaking, it appears that at 18 mills, the cost to our property owners is a little higher. We understand that City of Wichita, which is our closest peer, looking at their budget, trying to determine what their capital expenditures are, what their debt service is, that is not included in their published budget, probably pushes them up closer to 16 mills is what we're guesstimating, but again, that's not exact science, and we haven't asked them to give us a audit on their actual cost, but trying to understand where we stand in the big scheme of things and how that plays out as far as our role in the future. If people can get fire service at a much lesser cost and they perceive that fire service to be adequate, then are they going to be inclined to want to opt into a higher cost model unless we're able to push the mill levy down for everybody by bringing in additional properties? So that's the million-dollar question. So looking across all those jurisdictions that are not within the fire district presently, if we applied the 18.392 mill levy to each one of those jurisdictions, what we would find is out in the rural part of the county, the smaller communities, if you brought all of those in at 18.392 mills without reducing the mill levy, that would generate just about 6.7 million extra dollars per year, with the understanding that we would then have obligations to provide adequate fire service in those communities, and the question would be, with our current station placements and with our current staffing, what would we need to do to supplement those stations and that staffing to provide that type of service? And the type of money that would be brought in at that mill levy rate would be 6.7. If you throw in the City of Wichita, that generates about another $60 million. And currently their annual published budget is about $46 million. Again, I don't think that includes debt service on fire stations and capital investments and apparatus and that type of stuff. So what this does is just give us some idea of what type of valuation is out there that would be available if we, at some point in the future, had consensus that everybody wanted to be part of a single district across the county, and then what that would look like if we lower the mill rate. Those numbers would decrease by that rate.
Rusty, hold on just a second.
Yes, sir.
If all of those were in Sedgwick County Fire District Number 1 or some other named organization that was consolidated, it wouldn't cost 18 mills across the board.
The assumption would be that I think the desire would be to reduce the mill levy and the cost per property based on the higher rate of revenue. The calculations we have not made are, to what degree would we have to increase staffing, and would we have to create new station placements in order to provide adequate service in those areas that we brought into the district? Would they keep their volunteer fire departments as a supplemental? Would we take over their stations as they currently exist and simply put staff in it? To stand up a station with four bodies, three firefighters and a lieutenant, is just over $800,000 presently. If we staffed it fully with 5 bodies, that would be in excess of $1 million just for personnel for one station. That's without getting into apparatus, that's without building another station or upgrading a station. So I think the ultimate goal, if we brought into it, if we had a single fire district with whatever kind of board it was that the cost across the board would be less for everybody. The next analysis would be, whether with the current station placements, do we have sufficient resources to provide adequate service in those areas, or will we have to supplement our staffing, put bodies out in those far reaches, such as out in Cheney or down in Clearwater, down in those areas to supplement our staffing, and how would that balance out with the increase in revenues and a lower mill rate? And we haven't crunched those numbers specifically. I just put this table on here to give some feel for what type of money is out there at the current mill levy rate. If you brought in all those townships and municipalities that currently aren't in there, that equates to $6 million, which is a little over a third of what we currently generate with the existing district as it is.
Okay.
I mean, we're generating 16.4 million currently with the land area we currently cover. This would bring in another 6 million. Is that enough to turn around and provide adequate services to those communities if they give up their volunteer fire departments? And that's the numbers we haven't crunched yet.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So with that, it brings us to the discussion of options. Nobody has anything they want to talk about at this point. The chief did sit down with some of the fire chiefs from across the county, and he also invited some other folks to come in and offer input. In the paper, there were some pros and cons listed with these options, and those pros and cons were feedback from the fire chiefs and from the folks that the chief invited in to run some of these options by and see what their thoughts were on them. So we did have a little bit of stakeholder input on some of these options. The first one is legislation, something that we could pursue now or in the future. Legislative options to try to enhance the financial stability of the district. That includes adopting a statutory type requirement that exists in Johnson County. The Johnson County language in the statute does not prohibit annexation by a municipality. However, it does require the municipality negotiate with the fire district before the annexation and that they reach an agreement. Generally, there's potentially some type of compensation that would be paid by the municipality to the district before the district releases the property to the custody of the municipality, who will then begin to provide fire service. There's also a stipulation in the statute, as I understand it, that when that annexation occurs and the fire district has approved it, if there have been bond issuances to pay for capital improvements, fire stations, that type of thing, that the residents in that annexed area will still be obligated to pay taxes on that debt service until it's expired. So while the amount that they pay may be reduced, they still have some obligation to help pay off the bonds that were issued while they were part of the district until that bond is paid off. And that's the language in the statute up there. So it doesn't prohibit annexation, but it manages it in a way that allows the fire district to recover some compensation and or maintain some level of revenue to cover debt requirements that existed while those folks were part of the district. Another legislative option is to prohibit cities or townships not in the district from offering service to others. They can provide service within the limits of their city proper, but that they can't contract out to others. In the same token, by doing that, it would basically lock in anybody in an area not within a municipality from opting out of the district in order to have some alternative means of fire service, i.e. The volunteer department closest to them. They wouldn't be able to opt out of the district to have the cheaper service because that fire service cannot contract outside their city limits. A third option would be to take some type of legislative action to exempt fire districts from the IRB tax exemption. If IRBs are issued, either the fire district taxes would not be exempted, or there would be a statutory requirement that the property owner, the business, whatever it is, enter into a service agreement and continue to make payments to the fire district to ensure that the fire district has that continued revenue stream for that piece of property. And then another option, which has been brought up by Commissioner Howell in the past, is would be also require legislative action, some type of legislation that would allow for the fire district to act as a tax collection entity who could then subcontract out or contract out to the county for fire service. The county would hold and own all assets and personnel. The fire district would collect the taxes and pay the county for fire service. And as I understand, part of that proposal would be possibly that, as needed, the county could in that model provide financial support to the fire district as well. With those monies coming from the county collective, it would alleviate some of the concern about a select number of bodies in the district paying for service that's being provided to other customers who are not paying. So those are some legislative possibilities that have been tossed out and discussed, and I understand that discussions will continue later this month on legislative platform, which may include some of these discussions on some of these options. Any thoughts or discussions on any of this material? Okay. Aid agreements. Options with aid agreements. Options that were discussed regarding aid agreements include maintaining a similar system to what we have now. Simply going out to these, to our peer fire departments, taking the agreements we have in place, evaluating those for contemporary capabilities and needs, and updating those to be reflective of how we want fire service to exist in the county presently. Making sure that we're being responsible with our resources and conservative with our resources, and the same with them. Make sure that we have language that discourages jumping calls, but makes us available to assist each other upon request. And that way, when it comes to jumping calls and pushing resources out that aren't necessarily needed, we change that culture if it still exists, and to the extent that it exists, and make it dependent upon the specifics of the agreement, whether it's mutual or auto aid, with no fee attached to it, of course. Another option is fire district standard policy. We as a fire district simply create a standard policy and say, these are the instances when we will provide aid, and these are the instances when we will not. Across the board for all jurisdictions, no modifications are made based on particular needs. And that way it's very clear to our personnel when they can and can't respond, and they're not trying to interpret different language in different agreements. So that's an option. I don't know that it's an option that's most favorable, and I don't know if anybody has any comments on that, but it's always an option.
Are we doing that now?
Are you doing
any semblance of that now, just based on policy?
Yes, on some level. It's based on, we have agreements in place, but the chief and his staff have implemented some protocol, some policy relating to not dumping a station. In other words, more tactical deployment. In the past, I think the practice was, if we got a call, everything in the station closest is going to roll. Currently, it's more of an evaluation process. What type of call is it? What do the needs appear to be? If the needs are not emergent, let's send one unit. If we need to send more, then we will strategically determine where those should come from, as opposed to dumping a full station and leaving a full area of the county unprotected and requiring resources to come from far greater distance to cover our area because we've left and gone somewhere else. So yeah, there's been some policy adjustment on the part of the chief and his staff with the aid agreements in mind when they did that. So, and it hasn't been written into a formal policy, it's more of a directive. It's a policy by order of the chief, but it hasn't been written into a formal policy at this point. It would need to be formalized.
Somebody covered that in the city of Wichita agreement, right?
We did.
Formalize that as well as they formalize the same. with the transitional space and the black line and all that.
And then another option, which has been discussed, is the option of some type of fee schedule. There are various models out there that we looked at, anywhere from a single fee schedule. This fire district has a fee schedule, and if we're going to help you, this is what our fee schedule is, to a more cooperative type fee schedule where all of the agencies within that jurisdiction have a threshold fee schedule. They look at their historic responses, kind of get a baseline for what their historic response assistance to each other was, and that's where they draw the line. And they say if you request aid above what the normal threshold has been or the baseline has been in the past, then these are the rates that you'll pay, and vice versa. If we come into your jurisdiction, or if we request you to come into our jurisdiction at a rate greater than the base, then we will owe you. And at the end of the year, they all sit down with the calculations of how many times each has gone into each other's jurisdiction upon request, and meet out the details of what that billing is going to look like, and then they bill each other. Sometimes it's a wash, sometimes it may not be, but it's mutual across the board. Everybody pays everybody based on a baseline threshold type agreement. Again, we did some calculations, as you saw earlier, as to what we believe the cost of rolling out of a station and providing service is per vehicle or per apparatus with personnel. The City of Wichita has crunched the same type of numbers, so it would be that type of fee agreement that we would sit down and negotiate with each jurisdiction, and then come up with a method by which to make those calculations. We would need some type of CAD product, which we're going to have a new CAD product in a couple of years, but we would need some type of product that could help track very closely when aid was specifically requested and what aid was given, how many apparatus were requested and sent, in order to ensure equitable billing and accurate billing. So that would be a piece that would have to be worked out as part of a fee type schedule across the board. Additionally, any type of action like that, the jurisdictions have made it clear that they need time to budget. If that's the way that the fire district thought that they wanted to go, then they would request some type of time frame where they can budget for it in the future, because their current budgets would not be able to bear such a charge. With the understanding that based on our numbers, there's a couple of jurisdictions that we would probably owe money to, as opposed to them owing money to us. But again, that's another option that we can further explore as required. And finally, unification or consolidation. Again, in the past, there were some efforts between the City of Wichita and the Fire District, actually multiple times, multiple iterations over the years, where talks about consolidation and unification occurred. Studies were done. There's volumes of literature in my office from those historic efforts, detailing the processes they went through and the conclusions they reached. Out of that came some instances of unification. Again, hazardous materials, tactical rescue units, training together. There were some administrative efforts that were made, combined vehicle maintenance for a period of time, and then that ended, and each jurisdiction began taking care of their own again. But there's still some possibilities out there that could be explored as far as unification. Is it possible to unify training? We have a joint law enforcement training center. Is it possible to have a joint fire training center? Are there possibilities in unifying some of the administrative responsibilities, fire prevention, inspections, plan reviews, those types of things? Are there any things there that can be done and unified to streamline processes across the jurisdictions, Sedgwick County and Wichita specifically? And then organizational consolidation. Are we to the point that we want to resume an exploration of the potential of consolidating Wichita and Sedgwick County Fire District 1 into a single entity? And is there a way forward in the future at some point where other municipalities do other municipalities have an interest in foregoing their personal fire service and looking at a bigger picture consolidated fire district across the county? Having conversations with the fire chiefs, I think the answer to that question was, I don't know that anybody at this point in time has indicated a specific interest in that, but we haven't had enough talks, real discussions to know where people stand on the issue of their fire departments. Do they see growth in their communities in the future where they believe that they can increase funding to their fire departments and grow those fire departments as their community grows? Or do they see a future where they want to get out of the business and look to a consolidated fire district? And we just don't know the answer to that question yet. But it's something that, if the board has the will, it's something that we can certainly begin to research more in depth. Tentatively, we have a group of people who are willing to potentially sit down as a working group and start talking through some of these issues, talking about these issues, and moving in some direction. Don't know what direction yet. It'll be at the will of the working group as we hold listening sessions and try to understand where they are in their communities and what they see in the future. But it's certainly something that a group of people have indicated they are willing to sit down and talk about. And then the final would be to take no action. Just kind of maintain the status quo, do nothing. We know that there are gaps in service where we depend on our partners, and our partners depend on us to fill those gaps, provide assistance. There is no department that can be wholly self-sufficient and never need assistance. A couple of incidents simultaneously operating can quickly take away resources to the point that without assistance, calls fall behind and citizens are not getting the service they need. So there is some degree of interdependence between all of the entities in the county. We do have overlap in service, jurisdictions being paid by townships that are paying municipal volunteer departments to supplement, residents in townships paying the district to come in whenever another municipality is covering the majority of their service area. So we do have some overlap, and are those things that we can fix with agreements, or does other action need to be taken? And finally, taking no action doesn't address the issue of improving resource allocations across the county. So I don't know that no action is really viable, but it's always an option. Again, here's a map of the district. You can see who covers what, and you can pretty well identify where service gaps exist, where we count on other municipal fire departments to provide service to us because they are closer, and where we provide service to them because we have the resources that they may not have. Yes, sir.
Gordondale, City of Mulvaney. On July 10th, the majority of the chiefs here met to discuss this very topic. Our number one concern was safety and security, not only for the citizens that we serve, but as well as the firefighters. This is why these agreements are in place, your auto aid and your mutual aid agreements. That group agreed on July 10th that it was a consensus that everything was status quo. And here we are 4 meetings later to determine. So the no action was the agreement amongst those parties. Though the city of Wichita was not present at that meeting, and it is important that everyone sat down and we agreed that to monitor the effective call management was one of the responsibilities as a group, just to have effective management on the different calls that we run. The other issue I was looking at was, if we talk about 80% of the calls being EMS related, is this truly a fire concern or is this an EMS concern? Understanding the dispatching of fire resources on all of your EMS calls, is that a necessity that needs to occur, or does the response model need to change on the EMS side? Is that something you looked at?
So I understand that at the chiefs meeting, the general feeling and consensus of the chiefs was that maintaining the current arrangement with good agreements between the jurisdictions was the desired action at this time. So I do understand that. And as far as the medical model is concerned, the model that exists is designed that EMS is not necessarily the first medical response. It is the transport response that provides advanced life support for the patient from scene to hospital, but there is not adequate EMS coverage to be the first responder to every medical across the county and all the municipalities. I mean, the model is built so that fire provides medical first response in many instances, not every instance, but in many instances, and EMS is a first responder, but they generally require support of EMS or fire in a lot of instances. So it would require a modification to the medical model if we say that we're going to take fire completely out of the equation and they're not going to respond to medical at all.
I was just, from a cost-effective standpoint, that might be more cost-effective.
You advocate diminishing fire's responsibility for medical first response?
If I have a headache and you're dispatching a fire unit to my headache, I don't think it's cost-effective.
Yeah.
Dispatch an ambulance or fund an ambulance much cheaper than you could fund that fire apparatus.
And actually that, on those low acuity calls, Wichita can speak to that, but they're taking some specific action to try to mitigate some of their very low acuity medical calls. And simultaneously, it's not cost effective to send an ambulance to a headache call. There are other things that we need to be looking at to deal with those low acuity medical calls, to remove those from the 911 response system completely. And that's a whole other conversation, but it does tie directly into fire service and the number of medical calls that fire service makes relative to other types of fire response calls. Yes, sir.
I'm not playing the devil's advocate here, just for the simple reason, coming here a few years ago and seeing the model, the present status quo model that we were using, we were within a year with the fire district of going defunct. We're enjoying high valuations. We are enjoying some good business practices where we created some efficiencies and additional revenue. But if we were, 3 years ago, and we were, still had the same valuations we did then, now we would be defunct. So how can status quo be the option? It's clear that there are steps that we need to take. We may have more time to take those steps than we did 3 years ago, but how can status quo be the option? I just don't know how we can just wait for that time to come and then have to quickly react when we have some time to actually plan and be more deliberative in our action.
I guess something to consider, and it may never happen, it hasn't happened, but if the fire district became financially insolvent or otherwise didn't exist, then it would require that the other departments in the county step up and take responsibility for coverage across the county, period. All the areas that Sedgwick County Fire District 1 covers, that is paid for by their constituents, wouldn't have fire coverage unless the volunteers funded and staffed up in order to be able to make the responses and cover all those areas that they currently don't cover. And I guess what would that look like? Are those municipalities and those fire departments capable now of doing that? Do we not need the fire district because the capability already exists across the county to cover all of those areas? Yes, sir.
Lawrence Fan out of Mount Hope. We have the unique situation where we have an ambulance sitting right next to our engine, which responds to all medical calls. We as a fire department aren't the first responders to medical calls because of that. We have an ambulance. And you were gracious enough to come out and talk to us and really look at the number of calls received, and we thought some of those may be medical. And I'm not sure how that all plays into this discussion with our fire department. They're a completely differently funded organization. So if they go out as first responders, they need support. They will ask to page out Mount Hope Fire. So in our case, I don't think the medical can really come into play because we have a separate entity that handles our medical calls. And the only time we should be first responders to a medical call is if the ambulance is out, We have jump bag, we have a AED on the engine, and we will be the mode of transportation to take EMTs to a medical call if the ambulance is out. So, just something to consider.
Yes, ma'am. Chief?
James Snow, Wichita Fire Department. Do we just to ensure some clarity?
And I know you've referenced several times that some of the data was flawed, and I appreciate that, and I'm not for sure where the next steps are. And you also alluded to the fact that the city of Wichita's budget is very hard to actually dive into and to figure out what our actual numbers are. You know, the Wichita Fire Department is actually funded through operating budget, and so our mill levy numbers that were portrayed up there maybe a little bit flawed, and I would like the opportunity at some point in time to kind of go through that with some of our finance people. But I'd also like Chief Chris, because he runs our numbers for us, to provide you a little bit of a base so that you kind of get a clear understanding of what we look at as far as numbers and operating budget and our mill levy and so forth.
Very good, thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Leeds, County Commissioners, Mr. Manager. Just understanding that you hadn't asked, but we were wanting to provide some clarification, and we do look forward to engaging this group in discussions as we had started last week. The city's fire department is generally funded through the city's general fund. If you do a mill levy conversion, which we don't really operate that way, it looks like about 5.3 mils. Now, understanding we have some debt service fund and capital improvement funds, that comes up to about another 4.5, 4.9 mils. Total fire services for the city of Wichita would look like about 10 mils. One of the challenges, and I say challenges and not threats, that have faced us, as well as our predecessors who have looked at this a great number of times, is what that mill levy looks like for the city and for the county. Of course, we would expect the mill levy rate to decrease for the county while it would increase for the city of Wichita if we were to become a consolidated fire district. Again, that's just simple mathematics. It's something that's going to be a challenge moving forward. I would also point out that nobody outside of this room really cares what patch you wear on your shoulder. When somebody calls 911, they're simply looking to get the quickest, best, most efficient service that one could provide. And then finally, I would like to wrap up my comments by saying that retired Deputy Chief Rick Brazil is correct. We don't want to underestimate what that ISO impact is on both of our jurisdictions, because I think we both benefit from the efforts that our predecessors have laid out in front of us. And I'll stand for any questions. Thank you.
Chief, sorry, I already sat down. Just to be clear, is that 10 mils to the total cost to run your fire department?
Yeah.
As if that's the only revenue stream you have, would be 10 mils. If, like, just to, for example, we're completely funded by property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were in the same boat, you would run your fire department, the whole thing, for 10 mils.
That's correct. That's estimated. It'd be really close to that. There's other implications that we obviously haven't talked about yet. For example, the sales tax distribution formula is very different for the city than it is for the county.
Correct.
So there are more than likely other revenue streams that we would need to take into consideration that would be a shifting of funds. But if you look at it holistically, for us to provide the same kinds of services that we do now at the same level, it would cost the city taxpayers about 10 mils.
Okay, so do you know the total value of that 10 mils, what that would be?
I don't have that with me, not in front of me, but I'm sure it's probably something that we'll be talking about in the larger group setting.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be something to talk about. Yeah.
Well, no, so pension board benefits, separate entity. Well, we're not under capers, we're under Wichita Police and Fire pension system. I'll ask our budget analyst to give me some exact information as to what part of that funding source is allocated for the retirement system. You bet.
And if it was agreeable between the city and county, it might be about as easy to have finance talk with finance and just understand the numbers clearly so we know what they are. But those are the types of things that, understanding that there's some interest in status quo and understanding that we would like to at least explore if there's any will anywhere down the road for a move in a different direction, whether that's just simply with the city of Wichita or whether that's with other municipalities across the county, exploring those a little more in depth, getting clearer answers, maybe understanding statistical evaluations, apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges, since we all have different ways of calculating, and then understanding budgets. I think there's some value in that in the long run so that we better understand each other and how we operate and what that means to all the citizens across the county so that we're all on the same page and we understand what those opportunities are a little better and what those threats are a little better and hopefully come to a better conclusion on how to mitigate moving forward. Any other thoughts? Any other concerns? Any other questions?
I don't want to cut anyone off at all, if anyone has anything else they'd like to say. But just a couple comments. First of all, no action is not an option. I can understand from a fire chief's point of view that might be an option, but from a political view, it is absolutely not an option. I also believe that we need to make sure that the other large professional fire department, Derby, needs to be part of any kind of decisions as we move forward with any type of consolidation. And whether or not consolidation is an option, I don't know right now. We need to explore that and see if it is. There's legislation would have to be required no matter what if that happened. If we go into legislation and look at some type of consolidation, then you have to figure out who the taxing authority is and what kind of separate board would be required and what the composition of that board would be. I understand that if there is an overall consolidated fire board, whether it be with Derby, Wichita, and Sedgwick County or any other groups that might be involved in it, that they would have to have separate taxing authority. From what I understand the current law, whether that's changed or not. So if they have separate taxing authority, I also have been told that it has to be an elected board of some sort. So if it is an elected board, how would we go about that? Would it be an elected board elected across those jurisdictions, or would it be someone that is elected currently and appointed to that? For example, would it be a couple members out of Sedgwick County, a couple of city councilmen, a couple out of Derby if they were part of it? And again, this is not something that I'm telling you is going to happen. This is just options looking forward, okay? I don't want to scare anybody at all. The main thing that everyone in this Sedgwick County that we've got a map up here care about is that when they call 911 that they have someone respond that's going to take care of the problem, whatever it is, whether it's a medical problem, a fire problem, or whatever. I appreciate Chief Brazil being here today and giving us a little historic perspective on this. I appreciate all of the fire chiefs and all of the different organizations being here today. But again, I want to reiterate, as far as a political will, I do not believe that we have a political will to do nothing. Commissioner Unruh and I have talked with the mayor and the vice mayor of Wichita twice, and I don't believe that there is an obstacle other than knowing how to do it to some type of consolidation within Sedgwick County. Fire District Number 1 has to remain viable, whatever we do. And we can't overtax the people that are getting the resources, and we can't undertax the people that are getting the exact same resources. So we have to figure out what the correct balance is in this entire process. That's where you all come in. Today you have 5 commissioners sitting here, but we're going to be the ones that make the decisions based on your recommendations. We're not making the recommendations ourselves. We need your expertise to sit down and figure out how this happens. We need our attorneys to sit down and tell us what we need to do if we need to go to Topeka for legislation to make some changes. But there will be changes if I have anything to say about it. I want to make sure that everyone's clear on that. We're not going to do status quo. We're not going to be in the same position we were in a couple years ago where Fire District Number 1 was almost ready to go bankrupt. We're not going to overtax people, and we're not going to undertax people that are getting the exact same service. So I just wanted to make it clear. I don't know if, and I'm only one of 5 commissioners here today. I don't know if the other commissioners have something that they'd like to say from their political point of view, but that's Dave Dennis's point of view, that we are going to take some action, and I need to make sure that you all are part of this to make sure that we move forward in the right direction. So I, again, appreciate you all being here. Commissioner Howell, did you want to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of comments and questions. First of all, I agree with the previous speaker at the table over here. Safety and security is obviously our number one focus here. We've got to continue to provide services to the entire community no matter what happens here. I don't think anybody in this room wants us to disservice the people of Sedgwick County in any way. And so it's up to us to find a way to move forward, I guess, as a group of people that care very deeply about the safety and security of our community. So I thank you to Rusty for a good presentation and for the staff that put this together. A couple of comments and questions. One thing I understand, if you do consolidate services, number one, it requires willing partners. You can't consolidate without everybody that's being consolidated wanting to go to consolidation. In other words, there's no forced consolidation, if I understand correctly. Can you please clarify that truth?
It's my understanding with current statute that there is no forced consolidation.
Okay. So any of the cities that are in the room here that are concerned about big government basically taking your home rule authority away and trying to pull you into a consolidation against your will, I don't think that's even going to be an option. We shouldn't even talk about that. I think the consolidation ought to be a win-win-win. In other words, both partners of the consolidation want to move in that direction, and there's reasons to consolidate, primarily efficiency and better service. In other words, if there's duplication of services and you can find efficiencies and you can coordinate your services in a more enhanced way, then you can potentially reduce the costs overall to both entities, and that's probably the reasons for consolidation. But consolidation must be purposeful. I think we as a fire district are talking about consolidation potentially as a way to create solvency for the fire district in the long term. And some of these things of data brought up today, I think, show some of the problems with our current structure. We need to address those, but consolidation, if it's a solution, it's to create solvency for the fire district. And I think for both entities that are being consolidated would be for higher efficiency and hopefully a lower cost to the taxpayers and better services. So those are reasons for consolidation. One more truth I want to talk about is it true that if you did consolidate, the debt remains with the entity that has the debt now? You cannot consolidate that debt. Let's talk about that for a minute. Please confirm that truth.
It's my understanding, and I'll defer to legal, but it's my understanding that a fire district cannot assume the debt of another jurisdiction coming into that fire district.
So I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. I heard your first name, Rick, former chief deputy? Okay, thank you. Actually, it was Brad Crisp, Chief Crisp. Talked about some of the 10 mills was for debt service. Well, that would have to remain with the city of Wichita, regardless. And so the operational costs could transfer over to a new entity, but Wichita would have to retain that debt service. That's not transferable to a new entity. That is theirs no matter what. I don't think there's any way legally to get around that hurdle. So it would not be 10 mills. It'd be whatever the operational costs are. And the same thing for the county. If we were to consolidate, the fire district somehow would have to pay off their own debt. You can't transfer that debt to some new entity. So there's going to have to be some taxing jurisdiction. And by the way, one of your earlier slides, I think I saw the number 2034. Is that when we pay off our current debt for, what was that? What was that number? Please explain.
That was the bond issuance for the construction of, I believe, 3 fire stations.
Okay.
And it is slated to pay off in 2034 with 7.2 million total, 20-year bond set to pay off in 2034.
And just for reference, since I brought that up, Andale is going to be, is that cash funded out of current revenues, or is that going to be bonded? Do we know?
It's going to be cash funded.
It will be cash funded, so that's not going to add to that debt, but we currently have debt obligations up to 2034, correct?
Correct.
I'd like to talk about one of the options that was discussed this morning. That is the fee for service, aid agreements. I'm very concerned about that. I think it changes the discussion from let's go out there and help the people to we don't want to have to pay a bill. I'm concerned about these different organizations being reluctant to activate because they're because the budget hawks are going to be saying we can't afford that. Let's hold back a little bit. Let's not be aggressive on how we respond to these calls. In other words, right now we're anxious to get out there and provide the services, and sometimes we have more services that show up to a call than maybe are necessary. But we don't know who's going to get there first, and I think that's the reason why we have people from different directions responding to the same call. If you change this to a fee for service type of relationship, I am very concerned about how that changes our call response. And again, we started out by saying our issues are safety and security of our community. To me, that's counter to that goal. I'm very concerned about us watching the dollars and changing our response actions. And so I don't know that, to me, it just seems problematic to me. Not saying it couldn't happen. I'd also say, as District 5 Commissioner, Mulvane and Derby, according to that chart, if I see it correctly, Mulvane provides about 3-to-1 to the county, and Derby provides about 2-to-1 to the county, and this is a two-way street, right? So if we're going to charge Wichita for our responses to Wichita, which I think is what that implies, if that's what this model presents, that's going to create some budget challenges for Wichita. It may cause us to change the way we respond to Wichita, or their desire to have us respond to Wichita. But if everything did stay exactly the same, and I'm sure it would not, but if it did stay the same, we're going to be paying the city of Derby and the city of Mulvane because they provide more services to the county. And I think as it was described earlier, we don't actually have a lot of resources out in southeast Sedgwick County because we know that, I don't know how it happened, but over time it's evolved for us, I think, to depend on Mulvane and Derby to provide services to that part of the county. Had they not done that, perhaps we would have more stations out that way. Nevertheless, we are where we are. And so that is a two-way street. Should we go down that path? I understand that we're going to be paying Mulvane and Derby, which is fine, but about half, some of the other cities on there, we have the same thing where we provide less services to them than they provide to us. Of course, the elephant in the room, of course, is Wichita. That's where most of the money is going to be exchanged or tallied, and billed is going to be the city of Wichita. And I'm very concerned about that. Anyway, finally, there's an efficiency idea that I don't think was raised this morning. I think the Chief Snow, I think you're kind of doing this, and I think I heard someone over here already talk about this a minute ago. But if you have an ambulance next to a fire truck and you have a medical call, you'll send the ambulance, correct? Now, that's with a crew of 2, I assume. Not a crew of 3, but a crew of 2, right?
On the ambulance?
On the ambulance, yeah. Correct.
Be a driver, 2
Okay, most of our fire stations have crews of 5. And if we send a fire truck to a medical call, we know it's a medical call. Someone's having chest pains, or someone's having anxiety, someone fell out of bed and can't get up, whatever. We send a fire truck with a crew of 3, I understand, which leaves 2 people back at the station with another fire truck. And I presume if a fire call comes in, they're going to take that fire truck with a crew of 2, I guess. And Chief Leak, maybe you can clarify that truth. I don't know.
Yeah, you may
Is that right?
You may respond with a squad, a 2-person squad to the medical.
So the squad may go out with just 2 people?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things I've talked about in the past amongst some of my staff is that we ought to have a less expensive medical response vehicle. Now, the challenge, of course, is if they show up on what they believe is a medical call and then it turns out to be a more serious call, like a car accident or, something requires more of a fire truck skill set and that type of thing, there's a fire or whatever, that may put us in a bad situation. But I think on a lot of these calls, probably 80%, I don't know, I'm just going to throw a number out there. Let's say 80% of the calls, we know these are medical calls before we leave the station. We're leaving the station with more expensive vehicles and possibly more people than we need. So one of the things we have to talk about is to put a less expensive vehicle designed for medical response in a fire station. We only have 9 fire stations in Sedgwick County. It would not cost us a huge amount of money to set that up. And then we could have our firefighter EMTs, when we know it's a medical call, dispatch them as a medical response team with 2 firefighters in a less expensive vehicle. That's an efficiency we have to explore. I think other departments are doing this already. See, Chief Snow, I think, just talked about this already, and it's been in the media. I think we need to put that on our list of things to talk about. I think it's a reasonable way to reduce some of our costs. And then, let's see here, I think really my points I'd make. I'd like to just to say to one of the options you raised, you actually used my name, which is fine. I'd like to explain that a little more deeply, and that is Sedgwick County Fire District Number 1 would contract with the county. What that would look like is that the fire district becomes a revenue generator, revenue collector only. In other words, there's a taxing jurisdiction. All of the personnel, all of the fire stations, all the apparatus, everything would transfer over to what I would call Sedgwick County Fire Department or Sedgwick County Fire. The only purpose they would exist would be to provide fire protection services back to the fire district. They wouldn't exist for any other reason. But if you look at these numbers, obviously there's a lot of calls that are being provided for outside the fire district, and so the fire district taxpayers are paying for a service the people outside their jurisdiction are receiving. That's just the truth. And taxes ought to be fair. And to the extent that it's hard to generate more revenue out of the fire district taxpayers and continue to raise that mill levy is going to cause it to collapse, I believe. It's already kind of precarious, and if you continue to raise the mill levy in the fire district, I think you're basically killing the fire district. So it's gone about as high as it can go. If we locked in some of the boundaries and could depend on that revenue somewhat, you could essentially hand over that revenue to Sedgwick County. We could have the Sedgwick County apparatus, Sedgwick County personnel, Sedgwick County fire stations that would be there primarily to respond into the fire district only. We would not just respond into other places that we don't respond to now. It'd be exactly the same scenario we do now. But if there ever is a shortfall of revenue, let's recognize the fact that Sedgwick County citizens are paying taxes to Sedgwick County, and Sedgwick County citizens are receiving benefits from the fire district. And so if there was some amount of money that transferred from the Sedgwick County government to, if you will, keep that part of the organization solvent, that's just reflecting the truth that there's people out there receiving benefits that don't receive, or so they don't pay into the district. It recognizes that. Now, to do that would require legislation. But it is a long-term, forever solution to this problem. I don't know when we would ever have to provide any subsidy. Maybe it'd be $100,000, maybe more, $500,000 someday down the road when the fire district, without changes, becomes insolvent. We have a revenue option called Sedgwick County government that could provide subsidies to what used to be the fire district. The reason we would do that is because people in Sedgwick County are receiving benefits and they're paying taxes to the county government. So recognizing that truth simply sets that thing back right up, or sets it straight up again, where people receiving benefits are paying taxes to the organization that provides those benefits. We would not exist for any other reason but to provide benefits to the fire district. But to the extent we are providing aid to other jurisdictions, it would recognize that truth. So that's kind of the idea. There's no way to get there without legislation, but it is possible to get there. Thank you.
I have a quick question. You know, in the past, we've asked for numbers as far as calls on county fire stations, you know, fire versus EMS. Do we have the same data for Wichita fire stations? If not, can we get it? And I've said all along, I agree the issue is how many medical calls we're sending our folks on. That's really what's generating this whole thing, and how that would ultimately be addressed as we move forward. I don't think it's actually structure of fires that's the issue, and us helping out or being helped out. It really is how we deal with the medical calls as we go forward, I think.
The City of Wichita did provide some numbers to us in the past week. They're not comprehensive, but they break out how many times they've responded in the fire district and other jurisdictions. So we have that, and I'm sure they would be gracious enough to provide additional statistics if we ask for them. So, I'll get you what I can.
What's that?
Get you what I can.
Any other comments today?
Mr. Chair.
Kathy Sexton, City of Derby. This is difficult. This is a big thing, and I appreciate that you all have taken on the idea of talking about it and looking into it. I think we have to avoid quick and what seem like easy solutions, or let's run to the legislature and ask for changes. I don't think we're ready for that. I think doing that makes us all look bad, and I think it's just not that easy. We didn't get here in a year or 3 years or 7 years during a recessionary time frame when mill levies weren't decreasing, as the information showed today, but they were growing at a lower rate than what we're used to, right? And, the idea of saying annexation is a threat because we can't predict when they're going to happen, that kind of rubs me the wrong way, to be real honest with you. We established at the City of Derby some years ago kind of a multi-year annexation plan, and one of my first meetings was meeting with the sheriff and then meeting with at that time, assistant county manager at that time over the fire department, saying, hey, because I, as many of you know, used to work at Sedgwick County. I did not have responsibility for the fire department, so don't claim to know the inner workings of the financials, but I knew annexations would affect the fire district's financials. And so when a city shows up and says, here's our multi-year annexation plan, if the county people who do the budgets don't build that into their financial projections, well, that's not a can't, that's a won't, or didn't. It's an oops, or a mea culpa, or let's do it different, but it's not a can't. So I have concern about some of the things alleged, and I'm glad we started with a basic report, but I think it's fair, and I'm glad it was said, that nobody called the City of Derby or the City of Wichita and gathered real numbers. And we don't do cost accounting in our budget documents, so looking at our budget documents and finding the page for fire department does not represent the full cost of running a fire department, because we have a different page for debt and a different page for employee benefits and a different page for utilities and operations and payroll and different things. So I do think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of comparing apples to apples and getting facts in our reports. It is unfortunate, the assessed valuation, lower growth in assessed valuation that we've all dealt with for a few years, and obviously it showed you all a weak point. And so, like I say, I applaud you for looking at that, but I think we really need to have a lot more discussions than have occurred so far to try to find some solutions. And some of it the county can look internally on, and not just, I think, the only solutions as identified in the paper today. One that was mentioned was IRBs and the exemptions that are being allowed for economic development, and whether those should be accompanied, and I don't know if you all consider these now for the IRBs you approve, but with pilot agreements or payment in lieu of taxes agreements to continue to get funding for your fire department when you're approving those. And if you've talked with Goddard and Bel Air and other cities that are in the fire department and do pay your 18 mills, and whether they have been persuaded to do pilots on their tax exemption for economic developments, because those would help you without harming us. And those you can do, I think, or it could be something at least to look at. Certainly building relationships and avoiding easy solutions, I think, would be what would appear to be easy solutions. I hesitate to say some of my comments because I learned a long time ago from my favorite attorneys that you don't want to say a whole lot when you don't bring your attorney and the other guy calling the meeting brings 5. So I do think that there's a lot of putting the cart before the horse in terms of thinking that we're going to have legal solutions and legislative solutions when I don't know. You noted that there was functional consolidation of a couple things with Wichita some years ago, and then you basically, I believe if I heard you right, said that all fell apart and failed. Well, I guess I would say let's look inward again and examine why it failed and have the circumstances changed since then. So let's not pursue consolidation if we can't even make successful for more than a few years a functional consolidation. I don't know why it failed. I have no idea. I agree with Commissioner Howell at the top, and I'm sure everybody believes this, that we have good people running these departments, and the problems and the solutions here are not about people who give medical rescue and firefighting, and not about the people running their departments. It's about the finances and the politics and the management, right? So, I mean, I guess I just feel like we should be taking responsibility, and no one should feel like this is about fire departments not being run well by fire chiefs, because I don't think that's it. I don't think anybody here thinks that's the issue. And so to refocus the conversation on a sort of a management level, I think would be a really good thing. And thank you for including Derby in your conversations today.
Anything else? First of all, we do pilot when we look at IRBs where that they're applicable. So that
Bel Air and everybody else in our district does too. They continue to pay our district.
yeah, for example, we just did Textron recently in February or so, and we did a pilot as part of that Textron IRB. So,
But we don't know what the other cities do.
we don't know what the other cities do.
So maybe that's what is that the item referenced in the report, is what the other cities in the district is?
Anyway, again, I appreciate everyone being here today. This is the start of the conversation. We have no solutions at this point in time. That's what we're looking for you to help us with, are solutions. We're not at the point we're making decisions. I was as surprised as Ms. Sexton about having 5 attorneys here today. I'm not trying to intimidate whatsoever. The biggest thing is that if in the future we do need to have some kind of legislative changes where we have to know what is legal and what's not legal currently and what we could do or couldn't do in the future. So we talk to our attorneys continuously whenever any of those types of decisions are made. So please don't feel intimidated by it, having 5 of our attorneys here today. Again,
Chairman, we're just trying to stay informed.
Good, thank you.
That's totally good.
And I appreciate their trying to stay informed. That's something that we need as they give us advice as we move into the future. But I wanted to make sure that everyone understands we don't have a solution right now. That's what we're looking for you all to help us with, to come up with a solution and figure out what direction we need to move for all of our citizens in Sedgwick County. So again, I appreciate you being here today. And if, Rusty, if you have anything else at all?
The only thing I would say is I think it's reasonable and appropriate to move forward and update these old agreements so that we're operating in a current atmosphere with new agreements that we know are proper. If the commission has no objections, I'm suggesting that we move through with these agencies and update just like we did with Wichita as we begin to talk more about the issues and come back with some solutions, or at least some recommendations.
Good. Well, I know that I, for one, look forward to any kind of recommendations that you all can come up with. We're not here to put solutions forward and you rubber stamp them. We're here for you to tell us what we need to do and for us to make a decision.
Hey, Chris, you want to talk about the working group at all? Who is on that?
We reached out to both the city administrators and fire chiefs in all of our towns and cities that have fire departments, and invited them to participate, have a voice in these conversations. Some of the city administrators delegated to their chiefs and their public safety directors, and some of the city administrators voiced an interest in being part of that conversation, including Mrs. Sexton. So that work group is made up of primarily groups of fire professionals and city administrators and/or their designees. We may find that we have additional voices that we need to include in that, but tentatively, the first meeting to kind of talk about how this meeting might roll out was last week, and a future meeting would include those same people, and if we identify other voices that need to be heard, we will bring them in as well. So, does that give you some clarity on what we're doing so far?
Hey, anything else? Thanks again. I guess we're adjourned.